Today we are going to be solving rational equations. If you remember, a rational equation is an equation with a variable in the denominator. It's the quotient of two polynomials. So for rational equations, you have multiple rationals in an equation that you need to solve. So you're trying to find the value of the variable. When you're solving a rational equation, the least common denominator is very, very important. So the first thing you want to do is to factor everything. So that includes numerators and denominators. Anything that can be factored, you want to go ahead and factor. So when I factor this first example, I get 5y over y times y minus 7 plus 4 over 2 times y minus 7 equals 10 over 2y. The reason you want to factor everything, especially the denominator, is so that you can find your least common denominator. When I look at my denominator, I have a 2, a y, and a y minus 7. Even though I have another 2y, if I have it in one denominator, I don't have to write it twice. So my least common denominator is the 2, the y, and the y minus 7. Now, you always want to think about your restrictions, because when you solve the equation, if your answer is part of the restrictions, then that's not actually an answer. It's called an extraneous solution because it makes your equation have a 0 in the denominator, which is not possible in math. So I look at my denominators and I find out what would make any of these denominators 0, and those are my restrictions. In this case, those restrictions are 0, because if I set y equal to 0, I get 0, or 7, because if I set y minus 7 equal to 0, I get 7. Okay, now that I know my least common denominator and my restrictions, I can solve the problem. The best and easiest way to solve the problem is to actually cancel out all of your denominators. In order to do that, you would multiply each part of the equation, every single part, by the least common denominator. Because it's an equation, you can do that because if you're multiplying both sides of the equation by the same thing, you're keeping your equation in balance. So I'm going to multiply every part of the equation by my least common denominator. So that means I'm going to multiply this one by 2y times y minus 7, this part times 2y times y minus 7, and this one as well. The nice thing here is now you can see things that cancel out. My y cancels with the y. My y minus 7 cancels with that y minus 7. And all I'm left with is the 2. So your denominator should cancel in each part if you found the least common denominator. So now I would just multiply 5y times 2. Similarly, in this fraction, that 2 cancels with that 2. The y minus 7 cancels with the y minus 7, and I'm left with only a y, so 4 times y. And then in the final fraction, the 2y cancels with the 2y, so I would be multiplying 10 times y minus 7. So, multiply your first equation, 5y times 2 gives me 10y, 4 times y gives me 4y, equals 10 times y minus 7. And then it's just a matter of solving that equation. So the whole reason for multiplying through by your least common denominator is you're turning your equation into a regular equation without a denominator to worry about. So now I'm just going to finish solving. So 10y plus 4y is 14y. Distribute my 10, and I get 10 times y, which is 10y, and 10 times negative 7, which is negative 70. Continuing, I would subtract 10y from both sides, and that will give me 4y equals negative 70. Then divide both sides by 4, and my final answer would be y equals negative 17.5. The last step is very important. You need to go back and look at your restrictions. Is the answer you got part of the restrictions you wrote earlier? My answer is negative 17.5. When I go back and look at my restrictions, they are 0 and 7. Because negative 17.5 is not 0 nor 7, then my answer is y equals negative 17.5. So for the first you try, I want you to pause the video and solve the problem. Remind yourself you need to find the least common denominator and the restrictions and multiply through by the least common denominator. So pause the video now and try that problem. Okay, so the least common denominator, first off, I did factor everything, nothing really factored, so it just stayed the same. If I look at my denominators, I have an x plus 3 and a 3, and this one doesn't have a denominator, it would be a 1. So my least common denominator is 3 and x plus 3. So then my restriction really only comes from this fraction because that's the only one with a variable in the denominator. My restriction would be that x cannot be negative 3. So now I will multiply through by the least common denominator, which is 3 times x plus 3. Notice in an equation you must multiply all parts of the equation in order to keep it in balance. So when I do that, things should cancel out. So x plus 3 will cancel with x plus 3 in the first equation. In the second equation, 3 cancels with 3. And in the last equation, there is no denominator, so nothing cancels. You are going to multiply 6 times 3 times x plus 3. When I start multiplying, on the first fraction, I have 10 times 3, which is 30. The second fraction, I have 10 times x plus 3. And for the last one, 6 times 3 gives me 18 times x plus 3. Then I'm going to distribute 10 times x and 10 times 3. Also 18 times x and 18 times 3. So that's going to give me 30 plus 10x plus 30 equals 18x plus 54. And then I'm just solving my equation. When I simplify the left side, I get 10x plus 60 equals 18x plus 54. Subtract 18x from both sides and subtract 60 from both sides. I get negative 8x equals negative 6. And when I divide by negative 8, I do get an answer of 3/4. So that is the answer I get. Now I just need to double check that it is not a part of my restriction. Well, my restriction was that x could not be negative 3. 3/4 is not negative 3, so therefore 3/4 is an answer. Okay, moving along to the second you try. So I want you again to pause the video, try the problem on your own, and then come back and look. For this video, for this you try, the denominator is n minus 8. There is only one denominator in the whole problem. It's n minus 8, so that is your least common denominator. And the restrictions for that denominator would be that n cannot be 8, because if n is 8, then your denominator would be 0. Okay, nothing factored, so it stayed the same. I'm going to multiply through by my least common denominator. Notice I do have to multiply by all parts of the fraction, including the whole number 1. So make sure you multiply all parts to keep your equation in balance. When I start canceling things out, this n minus 8 cancels with that n minus 8. Nothing canceled in this part. And then this n minus 8 cancels with that n minus 8. So when I actually multiply through, I'm left with a 1 here, minus 1 times n minus 8 equals the 7. So I'm going to distribute the negative 1. Notice that is a negative 1. So if I distribute, I get 1 minus n plus 8 equals 7. And then simplifying that further, 1 plus 8 is 9. So 9 minus n equals 7. Subtract 9 from both sides. Negative n's negative 2. Divide by negative 1, and you do get your answer of n equals 2. Again, always go back and check. Is that a part of my restriction? 2 is not the restriction. The only restriction is that n could not be 8. Because n is 2, that is our solution, and you are finished. Okay, example 2 is a little bit more complicated because in this example, you are going to end up with a quadratic that you're going to have to solve. So the steps are similar. You start out by factoring everything. Then you find your least common denominator and your restrictions. You're going to multiply each equation by the least common denominator, also the same. But when you go to solve it, you end up with a quadratic. You end up with an x squared term. So you are going to either need to solve it by factoring, which would be my suggestion if you're good at factoring, or by the quadratic formula. Either way, you're going to have to make your equation equal to 0 and then solve it by either factoring or the quadratic formula. And then you want to check all the solutions you have and make sure that none of them are in your restrictions. If they are, then that is not one of your solutions. If they are not part of the restrictions, then that is actually a solution. So the first thing is to factor everything. So when I factor all parts of this, I end up with 7x plus 3 doesn't factor. The denominator factored to x minus 3 times x minus 5. This one, nothing factored. The last one, technically I factored it because I wanted to turn that 3 minus x around. I didn't want to leave it as 3 minus x. I wanted to turn it into x minus 3 so that it would match up with another factor I had. In order to move around subtraction, I just factor out a negative 1. So if I factor out negative 1 from negative x, I get a positive x. If I factor out a negative 1 from 3, I get a negative 3. So that's how I can flip around a subtraction problem, factor out a negative 1. So there are my factors. Looking at that, I have an x minus 3 and an x minus 5 and a negative 1. So my least common denominator is negative 1 times x minus 3 times x minus 5. My restrictions then would be 3 and 5 because that's what would make the denominator 0. So x could not be 3 or 5. Okay, so I'm going to multiply through by my LCD. And when I do that, there are some things that are going to cancel. X minus 3 cancels with x minus 3. X minus 5 cancels with x minus 5. This x minus 5 cancels with that x minus 5. X minus 3 cancels with x minus 3. And the negative 1 cancels with the negative 1. So now I multiply with what's left. I have negative 1 times 7x plus 3. I'm going to make this a minus 3x because negative 1 times 3x is a negative 3x times x minus 3. And here all that's left is 1 times x minus 5, so that's just x minus 5. I'm going to simplify that further by distributing. So negative 1 times 7x, negative 1 times 3, negative 3x times x, negative 3x times 3. So I get negative 7x minus 3, negative 3x squared plus 9 still equals x minus 5. Now, because I have a quadratic term right here, this is a quadratic term, that tells me that I need to set everything equal to 0 so that I can either use the quadratic formula or factoring. I suggest always keeping your x squared term positive. That makes factoring so much easier. So I'm going to move everything on the left side of this equation over to the right. So I'm going to move everything over to the right. When I do that, I end up with a positive 3x squared plus 8x minus 11. You may want to pause the video here and solve that yourself and make sure you get the same solution as I did. From this point, you're going to factor. Again, if you'd like to pause for a second and factor it yourself to see if you can do it, it does factor. If it doesn't factor, you could also solve by the quadratic formula. When you factor this, you end up with 3x plus 11 times x minus 1. When I set each factor equal to 0, my two solutions are negative 11 over 3 and positive 1. When I go back and look at my restrictions, 3 and 5 are my restrictions. My answer is not 3 or 5, so that means both of those are solutions. So that is my final answer. Negative 11 over 3 and positive 1. For you try 3 and 4, stop the video now. I will post a second video called Rational Equation Notes Part 2 where I go through the answers to you try number 3 and number 4. So do those now and then go check out that video for those solutions.